You excited to be here? Amen. I was picking with Shepherd John. I told him, stay out my notes. Because when he first got up at the very beginning, he was already quoting some verses that were from my notes. But that's a confirmation, because how many realize that when you get a word and sometimes you're questioning it, you don't know, did I hear, is this the direction that you're leading me, or is this just something I'm doing on my own? And then you get here and you hear some of the very things from your notes from someone that hasn't looked at it, doesn't know, and it's not specifically from the Torah portion. It's things that he's pulling in and showing, and then you hear the worship team that goes along and just does exactly the same. Amen. So if there's ever a doubt or a question, then that should answer that surely Yahweh is speaking and he's doing something, and it's not just the person standing behind the pulpit that's hearing. There's other people that are hearing that come along and they add their voice. They're adding what Yahweh's showing them, and it all comes together for you to be able to hear and understand what it is the Father has for you in the days ahead. Amen? And that's exciting to me. As Shepherd John was already alluding to, this week's Torah portion is titled BaMidbar. It's translated as meaning in the wilderness. For a lot of you listening, you probably are familiar with that. Maybe perhaps you've been in a season where you've been and felt like you've been in the wilderness. And a lot of times when we're in the wilderness, we begin to question and cry out just like the children of Israel did. When are we getting out of here? We feel like, it should be time now. We're good. We're done. We feel like we've learned the lesson. Surely we can come out now. Surely it's time to get out of this place. And yet we find that a lot of times our timing and his timing are not the same things. And a lot of times when we think we've arrived, he reminds us, no, you haven't. And so then we go one more cycle around that mountain. And yet this week's Torah portion, as you begin to look at what it means to be in the wilderness, I believe it will begin to change our perspective and our view of what this place is and what it means to be in this place and why you're here. BaMidbar, in the wilderness, is taken from Numbers chapter 1, verses 1 through chapter 4, verse 20. And if you follow along in the Torah portions, you know that this begins a new book of the Torah. It's the book of Numbers. And it seems to fit its English name quite nicely if you read it from the English. It is nothing but a bunch of numbers and names, and it's a census. It's the numbering of the tribes of Israel. And if you focus on just the English wording of this week's Torah portion and the opening of this book, it's something that, why is this significant? Why is this important? And it's easy to just try to hurry up along and get on to the next. And yet the Hebrew focuses on something quite different. The Hebrew's name is BaMidbar, and it focuses not on necessarily what may be taking place, but it focuses on the location, the wilderness, Midbar. And when you begin to look at the concept of being in the wilderness, and how many feel like you're there right now, and if you don't feel like you're there right now, most likely you're headed there, or you just came out of there, right? The wilderness seems to constantly be a part of our day-to-day lives. Amen? Well, in fact, when Israel first begins their journey, how many realize that it becomes very evident there's two pathways out of Egypt? Exodus chapter 13, verses 17 through 18, begins to reveal to the children of Israel, there's the way of the Philistines. And so be encouraged if you feel like you've been in the wilderness. Because remember, there's two ways, and only one leads to the promises. Only one leads to the inheritance, and that's the way of the wilderness. And so the very thing that sometimes we feel downcast about, the very thing that we feel just like, my goodness, when are we getting out of this, is that very pathway, that very journey that's leading you to your promise. Amen? The way of the Philistines, it's interesting that the way of the wilderness is contrasted to the way of the Philistines. Well, when you go back and you begin to look at who the Philistines are, and you go back and look at what the name Philistine means, it's identifying the Philistines were a group of people who would wallow and roll in the dead things, in the dead words, in the dead seed. They were a group of individuals that were dictated to by their carnal flesh, and because of that, it became an opening and enabled them to be used by the enemy, and you see that again and again manifesting all the way up to Goliath. And yet, Yahweh reminds his people when you're leaving, there's two ways. There's two ways out of Egypt. You can go the way of the Philistines. You can go the way and you can continue to wallow and roll in all the bondage and the garbage that I'm attempting to bring you out of, or you can go the way of the wilderness. This pattern remains true because as the generation that's going to be gathered once again, how many realize he also makes a promise and a declaration that once again he's going to lead his people by way of the wilderness. In Ezekiel chapter 20, verse 35, it says, "And I will bring you into the wilderness of the people, and there will I plead with you face to face." And if you go back and you read all of Ezekiel chapter 20, you'll realize this isn't speaking about the generation currently here in the book of Numbers that was coming out of Egypt. He's talking about gathering the scattered of the house of Israel and all those that would come up under that name, that banner, so to speak. Well, guess what? For you to come out of where he scattered you and to come and return to your promises, your blessings, your inheritance, once again, it will be by way of the wilderness. And again, we see this alluded to in Revelation chapter 12, verse 14, where it says, "And to the woman were given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness, into her place, where she is nourished for a time and times and half a time from the face of the serpent." And so when you begin to look at this, the wilderness then becomes this place of protection. It's described as her place, the place that he is bringing and alluring and causing his bride to come in order for an encounter that's going to take place in the wilderness. Yet how many of you realize that both the pattern in Exodus with this generation that initially comes out of Egypt, as well as the book of Ezekiel when he begins to talk about leading the people again into the wilderness, it makes it clear that not everyone who enters the wilderness exits the wilderness to access the promises. We see in the book of Exodus an entire generation that goes in, takes the right path, they're led upon the right journey, they don't make it out. The book of Ezekiel speaks of this, and he says that he's going to cause you to pass under the rod, but in passing under that rod, it's going to purge the rebels out from among those that have come into the wilderness. In other words, not everyone that enters the wilderness will access the promises and the blessings, and it seems to be that there's something that happens while they're here. The wilderness becomes a place of sifting. And so then it would behoove us to then take a closer look at what takes place here. Because we've already all acknowledged, it seems as if our lives have been defined by wilderness journeys. Either we're in the midst of one, we've just come out of one, or we're looking at one and we're headed there right now. And yet he's reminding us that there's something that should take place in this wilderness that's going to determine whether or not you're going to access the promises that he's spoken to you in your life. And so we find that the wilderness is not only this location that's the future place where he's going to bring the body as a whole, where we're headed, but we find that also on a personal level as well, to access the promises and the blessings and the word that he's spoken to you as an individual will require you to enter a wilderness season to access that promise. And I don't know about you, but how many of you want to make sure that you're ready, you're capable, you're in tune, you're listening so that you can access what he's spoken in your life? Amen? Well, let's look at this word wilderness. This is the way that he's going to lead you. Wilderness is Strong's number 4057, midbar, and it's translated as meaning a wilderness, a pasture. But it can also be translated as meaning the mouth. It's from the root word dabar, which means to speak, to declare, to converse, to command, to promise, to sing. The dabar is the promised word. And so we find that what the rest of the world will look at this place, the wilderness, and see it as this dry, barren place. For those that have ears to hear, it becomes the mouth where the promised word is spoken and declared. And it's interesting, as you continue to look at this, you'll find that this phrase, BaMidbar, it has a numerical value of 248. And it's the same value as the phrase, Kol Yahweh Elohim, the voice of Yahweh Elohim. The Kol of Yahweh is first seen as the voice walking in the cool of the day in Genesis chapter 3, verse 8. In fact, when you begin to look at this, you'll find that not only does this voice walk, but later you'll find that this voice is visible, it's seen. How can you see a voice? How can a voice walk? This voice is visible and it's seen by the people. And so it seems that from the very beginning, he's already beginning to tell you and begin to relay that this voice is something more than just something you hear. This voice, it's about something that's embodying the presence, the manifest presence of Yahweh. And we find that this voice is seen in contrast with those that would choose the way of the Philistines. So you can choose to wallow in those dead, carnal, fleshly words that are not going to bring about your promises, or you can choose to come to the Midbar, the location where the mouth is going to speak, and you'll have an encounter with the voice that walks. 248 is the same value as also as the phrase Beit Selim Elohim, in the image of Elohim. Could it be that the wilderness is where we are brought to the place where the mouth of the word is declared in order to have an encounter with the voice that walks? And as that voice speaks, it begins to unleash the creative power. How many of you know that Yahweh spoke everything into existence? So when that voice speaks, it contains that same creative power and ability within it. And the moment that it begins to speak and open again, those who hear become transformed into the image of Elohim. Amen? And so now when you begin to look at this place of the Midbar, the wilderness, Yahweh already from the very beginning is beginning to define it as this is the place where his mouth is going to speak forth the promised word with the intention of transforming whoever has entered into the wilderness. Now, it's no accident that this same voice is also seen at Sinai. And here in Numbers, we're told they're in the wilderness of Sinai. In Exodus chapter 19 and chapter 20, you'll find that it's translated as thunderings. They see the thunderings and the lightning on the mountain, and yet the Hebrew word is kol. They saw the voice. The voice is seen by the people upon the mountain. And it begins to identify then and connect the dots that the wilderness is the abode of his voice. It's the habitation of his voice. And this is where he's promising to bring his people. This is where you've already admitted it seems as if you've been in a wilderness place in your own personal lives. Oh my goodness, what better place to be than the place where his voice resides? And so we find what a powerful promise that he's making here, that he's going to bring you to the habitation where his voice is. And when we begin to look at this in the days ahead, the promise is there in Ezekiel and Revelation. Shepherd John already alluded to this. Simultaneously as when he's making these promises that he's going to draw the scattered people, the scattered house of Israel into the wilderness, at the same time we're told in Amos chapter 8 verse 11 what else is taking place. Behold, the days come, saith Yahweh Adonai, that I will send a famine in the land, not a famine of bread nor a thirst for water, but of hearing the words of Yahweh. And so now you can begin to understand as he's beginning to draw his people, he's letting you know that there's a place where his voice is going to reside. But the rest of the world, there's going to be a famine of that same voice. There's going to be a famine of that same word. And now you can begin to understand why he begins to draw and lure you into this place known as the Midbar, because it's here that you're going to hear the voice while the rest of the world is experiencing a famine of that same voice. But yet the choice is yours. Remember, it's contrasted. You can go the way of the wilderness, or you can choose to go the way of the Philistines. You can choose to continue to wallow and roll in the dead seed and those dead words that have no life, that have constantly been filling, or you can choose to come here to the Midbar, the place where his voice speaks. Amen? Yet remember, not all that enter into this place actually access the promises. And it seems to indicate then that the focus when you enter the Midbar, how long you'll stay there, if you make it out, if you access the promises, seems to then focus on our own ability to hear. How many of you realize that Moses could not hear for the people? They tell him to, you go up, you go listen, but that same generation, because they failed to hear the voice, they don't make it in. And so it seems that the wilderness begins to focus on each individual person of Israel that's brought to the wilderness. Can you hear the voice? To hear in Hebrew is Shema. And it means not only to hear, but to gain an understanding of what you've heard in order to be obedient, to follow it, and act on it. With that said, we can now understand that our hearing affects our future. What you hear will affect your direction. What you hear will affect what becomes manifest in your life. And we find that a lot of times we can be given a promised word from the Father, but how many of you know that those Philistine words, they attempt to come along and cut off that promised word, and yet you can only choose to hear one or the other. Which one are you going to listen to? You can't serve two masters. You can't hear two words. Which one is the one you're going to latch on to and hold on to see that promise made manifest? Amen? So it seems our ability to hear, not only is it going to affect our future, whether we access your inheritance, your promises, your blessings, but it's also directly connected in turn to once again being transformed into his image. Well, let's look further at this. What does it mean to be in his image? When he first creates Adam, he makes the statement that he's created in his image. The word image in Hebrew, it's Strong's number 6754, Selim, meaning image or likeness. But so often with our Western mindset, we think, oh yeah, we look like him from the natural. This is what he looks like. But it doesn't imply the appearance. Selim implies the function. Elohim placed within man a representation of his own function. In other words, his character, his mindset, his purpose. Adam was created in order to be after the image, literally after the mind of Yahweh, after the character, after the purpose to represent him on the earth. And so we find that the wilderness is designed to change your nature, which is exactly what Shepherd John was also alluding to. All these things that begin to come up, they've got to be moved out of the way. Why? Because that's not his nature. That's that fallen nature. That's that Philistine nature. That's the one that's been wallowing in this and continuing to foment this, and yet he's trying to change all that. All that's got to get out of the way because he's changing your nature and he's renewing your mind. Why? So that you can access the promises and the blessings he has for you. Amen? Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 through 27 is where we first see this word Selim, image. It says, and Elohim said, let us make man in our image, Selim, after our likeness, and let them have dominion. Isn't it interesting that it's only when you're in the image of Elohim, now you can have dominion. Now you can walk in authority. Now you can be fruitful. Now you can be blessed when you're after his image. So Elohim created man in his own image, Selim. In the image of Elohim created he him. Male and female created he them. King James can be a mouthful. So we find the concept of his image, Selim, is elaborated upon with the terms male and female. But with our watered-down English translation and concept of these terms, we miss it. The Hebrew words are zakar and nekibah. When he begins to say that I've created them in my image, he then begins to define what that image is, what that function is, and he describes it as zakar and nekibah. The concepts behind these two roles are that the female is one equipped, the nekibah is one equipped with the facility designed to receive something not of itself, yet integrated into itself, to take it and become one with it. Where the male is designed to submit its own reflection, the zakar. And that reflection becomes a memorial, a reminder. It's something that continues on that name. In other words, the ability to release seed, a reflection of oneself, and the ability to womb or nurture that seed to produce life. This is the function, this is the character of who Elohim is. Now, it's important to note that when this statement is made concerning the first man and woman, we know that they were created and designed with the ability to procreate by speaking forth the word of Elohim. Therefore, functioning in his Selim, in his image, yet it would require the two to be unified to do so. There must be both a releasing of seed or word, as well as one who integrates that word into his or herself in order to see it carried out. Could this be what Isaiah chapter 55 verse 11 is expounding upon? It says, so shall my word be that goeth forth out of my mouth. It shall not return to me void, but it shall accomplish what I please, and it shall prosper for which I sent it. Why? Because that's the image of Elohim. That's his function. That's his character. Because our Creator has the ability to both release the word, but also to carry it out and to see it to its fullness. This is his nature. And we find this is the first thing he's beginning to reveal about himself when he begins to create Adam. And it causes us to ask the question, my goodness, then why do we have such an issue questioning when if he says it, he will do it? From the very beginning, he lets you know, this is my nature, this is who I am, it's my character, it's my mindset. If I've spoken forth a word, if I've given you a promise, if I've placed a word in your heart, if I said it, I will do it. That's my nature, that's who I am. Amen? And how many of you realize that a lot of times there's a gestational cycle? So a lot of times we find that when a word is spoken and it's not immediately realized right then and there, we have an issue with it. But we don't have an issue with someone understanding, my goodness, they became pregnant. Well, there's a gestational cycle. You're not going to immediately tomorrow see that baby. And yet when it comes to the word of Yahweh, we have an issue. The moment it doesn't take place right then, well, then it must have not been from him, or we begin to question it, and now we have an issue regarding this, and yet he's reminding them, my very character, my nature, my image, who I am, is that not only will I speak forth this word, but I have the ability to womb it, to carry it all the way to its fulfillment. Amen? At first glance, it seems that Israel will function solely here in the wilderness as the Nechibah, the one that was brought here to receive the word spoken forth by the voice. Yet, according to Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, to be in his image, they must also learn to function as the Sakar, the one who releases or speaks forth the word as well, the one that will become a walking memorial of what that word is. They are here to learn to hear correctly and therefore speak correctly. Because how many realize that the way you hear affects naturally the way you speak? And so we find that he brings Israel to the wilderness. First, he must correct their hearing if they're ever going to correct the way they speak. And so by doing so, only in this fashion, only when they learn to hear correctly and therefore speak correctly, will they be transformed into his image and therefore have dominion and be able to enter the blessing and their inheritance. As you continue to look at this word Selim, image, how many of you realize that it's not only relegated to the image of Elohim? That's the first reference of it, but later we find this same word is used to describe idols that are made also after the image of other gods. And now you can begin to understand how your hearing can affect your future. What voice you choose to listen to in turn affects what you speak forth. And in other words, what you birth, what's born out of you, what type of fruit you produce. And if we've allowed a contrary word to take root, how many of you realize it will hinder you from hearing his voice? And you're going to see an example of that in just a moment. But not only when you allow this contrary word to become something that you listen to, it now begins to affect the image. Whose image you're after. In other words, what you're functioning like, what you're thinking like, your character, what you do, your purpose, your mindset. It begins to change that into another Selim, another image. Could it be that Israel has been brought to the mouth where the voice speaks in order to ensure that they will receive and become unified with the word of Yahweh, lest they be found in the image or a reflection of another? And it seems that this might be the defining factor of who is seen capable of entering the promised land, the inheritance and their blessings. Who is after his image? Who has heard while they were in the wilderness? Because how many of you realize that his promises are not for the Philistines? His promises are not for those that will continue to wallow and just roll in the dead words and the dead seed. And now that's the image. That's their mindset. That's their character. That's who they are. There has to be a nature change in the wilderness in order to access the blessings that are in store for you. It would seem then that perhaps this is why Yeshua states that the greatest commandment is in fact the Shema, to hear. Mark chapter 12, verse 29 says, and Yeshua answered him, the first of all the commandments is hear, Shema, O Israel, Yahweh our Elohim is one. And in Romans chapter 10, verse 17, we find this is built upon. It says, so then faith cometh by hearing, and hearing by the word of Yahweh. Notice that your faith comes by hearing and hearing. Not just hearing one time, not just, oh yeah, once, 10 years ago, I heard a voice. He spoke to me. It comes by hearing and hearing and hearing and hearing the word. Amen? In fact, one of the most repeated phrases by the Messiah is, "He that hath an ear, let him hear." He was the walking coal. He was the voice manifest on the earth. And yet, as the people were gathered, even then he had to remind them, in the presence of the coal, in the presence of the voice, "He that hath an ear, let him hear." The greatest commandment is to Shema Israel, to hear the word. Why? Because your hearing is going to affect your future. Your hearing is going to affect your direction. Your hearing is going to affect whose image you're made after. We're told there in Romans that faith comes by hearing and hearing. The word faith is, in Hebrew, it's Strong's number 529, emun or emunah, and it means faithfulness, trusting. But it's from the root word aman, which means to support, to confirm, to be faithful. But it can also have the sense of one who carries and cares for or nurtures a child. In other words, the faith, the ability to stand and be trustworthy, is defined by one who is capable of carrying and nurturing the word that they've heard and been given. And here in Romans, we find that it indicates it requires a constant hearing, a repetition of that word. And now you can understand why the name of the Philistines is such a powerful example and contrast to them being brought to the wilderness. Why? Because the Philistines are those that also constantly hear. They constantly roll and wallow, but it's not in the word of Yahweh. It's in the dead words. It's in the dead things and the dead seed, that carnal, fleshly nature, but it's a constant rolling and wallowing in this. And yet we find now he's bringing Israel to the place where now you must do the same. You must constantly hear, but it must be the word of Yahweh. You have to carry it all the way to its fruition. It's interesting that the ability to hear is the first sense that was compromised in the garden. When you go back and read in Genesis, the first thing we find is that the Nakash speaks to Eve, and what does she do? She hears it. It doesn't say it, but it's implied. The first thing she does, she hears what he says. And we find that it was also the first indicator when Adam and Eve hide from the voice that a compromise has taken place. Adam and Eve chose to listen to another word, and it took deep root. And now because of that, they're unable to hear the voice of Yahweh. When the voice walks, they hide from the voice. They can't be seen by the voice. In fact, Adam is warned from that point forward of the dangers of wallowing in what that voice said. The dangers of wallowing in the dust and the dead seed. Dust you are, Adam, and to dust you will return. And then he lets him know the Nakash is the one that's going to come along and eat those that are wallowing in the dust. And so from the very beginning, he's warning Adam, be careful, because by your hearing, you got here. And so we find that the first order of business in the wilderness is to restore Israel's ability to hear. In fact, what got them to Egypt in the first place? A physical famine, but if there's a physical famine, it's always shadow pictured and related to a spiritual famine as well. So a famine of the voice, a famine of the word is what got them to Egypt in the first place. And so now in order to get them out of Egypt and to get Egypt out of them, the hearing has to be restored. In fact, this seems to be so important that the final miracle that's performed by the Messiah in John chapter 18, verse 10, and you see it in Luke chapter 22, verse 51, is to heal the cut off ear of Malchus. Malchus is the Greek rendering of the Hebrew term Malkut, kingdom. The hearing was cut off by none other than Simon Peter, Shimon. His name comes from the word Shema, the one that's supposed to be able to hear. The hearing of the kingdom had been cut off. But Yeshua restores the ability to hear the voice, and this is his final miraculous act before he's now brought forth to be tried. Perhaps the coming season in the wilderness will be once again to restore the hearing. How many of you realize that in order to go forth and to access the blessings and the promises that are ahead of you, it will require your hearing to be restored? It's interesting as we continue to look at this that the first time the phrase BaMidbar, in the wilderness, is seen is in Genesis chapter 16, verse 7. And the angel of Yahweh found her by a fountain of water in the wilderness, BaMidbar, by the fountain in the way to Shur. And when you go back and look at Genesis 16, it's Hagar. Hagar is the first one who enters in the wilderness, BaMidbar. Quite interesting because that doesn't seem to fit the pattern. Wait a minute, Hagar is the first one that goes into the wilderness. Whoa, we're supposed to be Israel, Abraham and Sarah's lineage. What is Hagar doing in the wilderness? Hagar is Strong's number 1904. Her name, Hagar. It's translated as meaning flight, the sojourner. But it's interesting that when you break apart the letters of her name, you have the letter He, which means the, as a prefix, and the Gimel Resh root, Ger, which is the root for the word stranger. She's the stranger. Well, what is she the stranger to? If she's in the Midbar, it's the place of the voice. So it seems to infer that Hagar, being the first one to enter BaMidbar, it's revealing she's the stranger to the voice. Hagar is the bondwoman. She's a picture of the flesh. And yet here we find later the next group that is entering into BaMidbar, the wilderness, is the children of Israel. The children of Israel claim Sarah as their mother regarding their physical lineage at this point, and yet I believe the connection here is that he's showing them they're displaying the characteristics of Hagar. You may claim Sarah as your mother, but you're the bondwoman. You're the stranger to the voice, and now you have been brought to the same place she was, and guess what? She had an encounter with the voice. Hagar heard a message, a word in the wilderness. In fact, tying this together, we see that while at the encounter at Sinai, Israel's response to their reintroduction to the voice, in Exodus chapter 20, verse 19, this is their response. And they said unto Moshe, Speak thou with us, and we will hear, but let not Elohim speak with us, lest we die. They refuse to listen to the voice. It's quite interesting because Hagar, when she's in the wilderness, she at least does listen to the voice. She at least does do what the voice said, and she returns to Sarah. And yet here the children of Israel, they've been brought to the wilderness, and the first thing they do is when the voice begins to speak to them, they say, No. Don't talk to us. Moshe will listen to you, but we don't want to hear nothing else from the voice. You go listen, and then you can come tell us. How many realize the same response was given from Adam in the garden in Genesis chapter 3, verse 8? When the voice begins to walk in the cool of the day, the first thing Adam does is close his ears and hide from the voice. If you continue to look at this, it's interesting because this name Hagar, spelled with the He, Gimel, Resh, if you rearrange those letters of her name, it's spelled with the same letters that form the word Gera. Strong's number 1624, and it means to cause strife, to stir up, to contend, to provoke. And it really does describe that fleshly nature. The fleshly, carnal nature of man will always choose to cause strife, to stir up, to contend, and to provoke. But it's interesting because it's first used, this word Gera, in regards to Israel being commanded to not meddle or contend with, Gerah, certain nations. And the reason they're not to Gerah, to meddle or mess with those nations, they're told is because that's not part of their inheritance. That's not yours. Don't mess with it. Don't go over there meddling. Don't cause strife. That's not your inheritance. And so it seems to be tying together that as long as Israel is a stranger to the voice, as long as they're in bondage to their flesh, much like the shadow picture of Hagar, they have no part of the inheritance of Yahweh either. That's not your inheritance if you're still rolling and wallowing in the fleshly carnal nature. They must learn to shema. They must learn to hear, to then understand what they've heard, and then to be obedient to do what they've heard. In fact, Paul expounds upon this in Galatians chapter 4, verses 23 through 26. It says, But he who was of the bondwoman was born after the flesh, but he of the free woman was by promise, which things are an allegory. For these are the two covenants, the one from the Mount Sinai, which gendereth to bondage, which is Hagar. For this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia, and answers to Jerusalem, which now is and is in bondage with her children. But Jerusalem, which is above, is free, which is the mother of us all. And a lot of times people will read Galatians and they'll misconstrue it and they'll take it out of context and say, there it is, the Torah's done away with, it's bondage. I told you that was bondage. I told you don't go doing that. But it couldn't be further from the truth. When the Torah was given at Sinai by the voice, coal that was walking and seen on the mountain, the same voice that was seen in the garden, in BaMidbar, in the wilderness here. The Torah, when given at Sinai by the voice, what does it do? It exposes Israel as the bondwoman. Not the covenant, not what the voice is speaking, but the response from the people. They expose themselves as Hagar. Why? They're content to stay in the bondage. They're content to stay in their flesh. They're content to continue to wallow and roll in this. Yeah, they didn't go the route of the Philistines, but they brought the manner of the Philistines into the wilderness. And yet they're here for all of that to be broken off of them, for that to be removed, for a nature change to take place. And yet the moment they say, we don't want to hear it, we don't want to hear the voice, Moses, you go and talk to him. From that point on, you can see that nature doesn't change. Because every encounter, every test, every trial throughout the wilderness journey from there forward, what do? They moan, they grumble, they complain, and yet they don't understand that the very words out of their own mouth are beginning to plant seed, and it's creating an image, it's creating a nature, it's creating their surroundings, and now the very wilderness that's supposed to be the place where the mouth of Yahweh is speaking, instead it becomes that dry, barren place, and it becomes their grave. Why? Because they would not hear, they would not change what they heard, they would not change what they spoke, and they spoke it into existence themselves. Here in Galatians, Paul then makes the reference that the heavenly Jerusalem, referring to Yahweh's dwelling place, it's free. Their lack of hearing hindered them from being transformed into his image and therefore set free as well. Yet we're reminded of the numerical connections to this location, BaMidbar, the place where the image, the Selim, can be transposed upon the one willing to womb the word that's spoken. Could the intent when he brought them into the wilderness have been to transpose, to literally overlay the Jerusalem from above, the dwelling place of Yahweh, onto Israel encamped in the wilderness? And yet we find, as Paul so aptly describes, this is rejected. They're exposed as Hagar, a bondwoman, unable to womb or nourish that, unable to hear it or speak it forth. But the pattern remains the same, pointing towards his intent yet again concerning the future wilderness. Because remember, Ezekiel and Revelation both speak of, once again, you're going to be brought to the wilderness. In other words, here we go, round two. That generation didn't get it. They expose themselves as Hagar, the bondwoman, and they die off in the wilderness. But now the scattered, hopefully you've been in the wilderness long enough of the people, and now I'm going to bring you to the wilderness where the voice is going to speak, and the intention is that he will now begin to transpose or literally overlay his dwelling place upon his people. That's how you become the living stone's tabernacle. Why? The presence that's above now becomes transposed. It literally becomes down and placed upon you. Amen? To take a group of people that are willing to shema, to hear, and to cause them to walk in dominion as they're transformed into his image is the intention when he brings this future generation into the wilderness. Why? Because that generation has the task ahead of them to make his enemies his footstool. But they cannot walk in dominion unless they first are transfigured into his image by their hearing and in turn learning to speak. Amen? And yet we have to ask the question, what does this have to do with the census? Because he lets you know, BaMidbar, they're in the wilderness, but then the first thing he does as he begins to start this is he begins to number the children of Israel. Well, notice that the name Hagar, it's also a cognate. It's formed with the same letters as the word Gera. Strong's number 1626, Gimel Resh He. Gera is translated as meaning a weight. It's the 20th of a shekel. And we find that the Gera is specifically addressed in connection with the census or the numbering. Why? Everyone who is numbered is to bring a half shekel. And then he makes the statement, oh, by the way, a shekel is 20 geras. But we know that there's nothing just placed there for filler material. He doesn't just throw that out there. Oh, in case you were wondering how much I expect, let me define it. I want this weight. I want 20 geras. In other words, he's letting them know, therefore, a weight worth that he's looking for is 10 geras. He wants half a shekel, so half of 20 geras, he wants 10 geras weight worth of that half a shekel. But it's interesting because the word gera is related specifically to Hagar. Hagar being the one that's the stranger to the voice. Do you think that maybe he was revealing something more than just, oh yeah, bring a shekel, I'm counting you, you got to pay to be counted? No, he's telling them, I want 10 gerahs. I want 10, the strangers to the voice, to be brought back. An interesting connection, seeing as there were 10 northern tribes that became the lost sheep of the house of Israel. They were a stranger to the voice until Messiah came. In Matthew chapter 15, verse 24, he makes this connection. And we find that Messiah is offered up at Golgotha. Golgotha, the root of this word is Golgolet in Hebrew. Strong's number 1538, it's translated as meaning skull. It's the polling place. It's the place of the census. Golgolet is seen here in this Torah portion. You're to number them by their heads, Golgolet. They're at Golgotha. In other words, when the children of Israel are numbered in the wilderness, symbolically, it's the analogy, they're here. They're at Golgotha. The place where the voice is speaking. And what is the voice looking for? He's looking for the 10, the lost, the scattered, the ones that have been a stranger to the voice. And as they're counted, it's symbolic of the fact that now those that have been estranged from the voice, they're now incorporated back in and they're made one with the voice. The place of the census, in order to restore the 10, the strangers to his voice that had no inheritance, no right of it outside of having an encounter with the voice of Elohim. Now you can begin to understand why Yeshua was crucified or executed where he was. Why? Because it was all about those that had no inheritance, no right, no promise, no blessing, because they had not heard the voice. They were a stranger to the voice. He comes and the voice chooses to speak here so that now they could be numbered. They could be counted. They could have access. They could have an inheritance. The numbering of Israel has everything to do with the calling back to those who had been lost. And how many of you realize since Adam, this defines creation? Adam hides from the voice. From that point forward, there were snatches, there were remnants, there was points where a voice, someone was able to hear a little bit better than others. Abraham heard the voice. Isaac, Jacob, Israel in the wilderness was intended to have that voice restored, but they rejected it. And now we find it takes that voice taking on bodily form, coming and once again walking among the people for the voice to be restored, their hearing restored to the people. They're called back, all who have been lost. It's interesting that they're also told that the connection here, he's looking at gerah, but he also calls it a shekel. He wants a half shekel. The word shekel in Hebrew, it's Strong's number 8255. It's translated as meaning shekel, to weigh out. Yet the Hebrew letters paint a very vivid picture. It's the Shin, Kuf, Lamed. The letter Shin represents the fire. But it's interesting because that Shin can also mean to transform, to transfigure, to change. It's connected to the Kuf Lamed root, which is the word kol, the word for voice. The fiery voice that has the power and the ability to change you, to transform you. They're numbered in the wilderness because Yahweh is waiting to see the one who had been a stranger to the voice in the past, the one who had been Hagar, be able to bring and offer up evidence that they've heard and encountered the fiery voice. Isn't that interesting? You bring the shekel. What am I supposed to bring? I'm supposed to bring fruit or evidence that I've heard the voice. There should be a change. There should be a transformation. There should be a different mindset in me than one that hasn't. There should be a different character, a different purpose in my life if I've had an encounter with the voice. And when they would bring this, when they would offer up the half shekel, if you're not careful, we get called, oh yeah, it's that coin. They bring a half shekel. They're counted. They're numbered. But yet the intent was that they would bring something that was evidence and proof. They've encountered the voice. They've heard the voice. They've had an encounter. The one that has been lost has come back. And when they brought the half shekel and they were counted, they were numbered, they now had access to what? They had access to the tabernacle. They had access to his dwelling place. In other words, the Jerusalem that was above could now descend. They could have access because they had encountered the voice. Amen? How many realize that the same is promised to you? That's why Messiah did what he did, so you could be counted. You could be numbered. You could have access to something that you were cut off from. In Numbers chapter 1, verse 2, it says this: Take ye the sum of all the congregation of the children of Israel, after their families by the house of their fathers, with the number of their names, every male by their polls. The word polls there is Golgolet. But let's break down some of the other words. He says, take ye the sum. In Hebrew, the word take there, it's Strong's number 5375, and it's nasa. It means to lift up, to bear up, to carry, to take, to receive something. Here it's conjugated in the Hebrew as seu. Shin, Aleph, Vav. It's interesting because it's the mirror image of the phrase Vayesh and fire. The Vav as a prefix indicates something that's a future. It has the ability to change something from the past tense to the future and from the future to the past. In other words, the ability to manifest those things which are not yet seen, or to cause teshuvah, to cause a return to where you were previously. And it's connected to esh, to fire. Perhaps it's pointing towards, even though you're still in a physical fleshly body, that there's still the ability by this vav, this connection, this point that will join two together, there's still the ability to have a connection and therefore a manifestation of his presence that enables you to walk after the Spirit, to walk in freedom and dominion and the blessing and not after the flesh. And it's through the numbering. How many of you realize that what Messiah was teaching, it was not a New Testament concept? He was trying to show them this at Sinai. He was there. The voice was walking on the mountain. They just wouldn't listen. So he had to come to them in a different form to hopefully get some to hear and understand. Yes, you're separated for a season from the voice like we were in the garden, but there's still a vav. There's still a connection. There's still the ability to have a manifestation for you to walk after the Spirit, for you to literally be clothed and embodied with his esh, his fire. Amen? It's connected to the word congregation. He says, take ye the sum of the congregation of the children of Israel. The word congregation, it's Strong's number 5712. It's idah. It's a congregation, a gathering, an appointed meeting. How many of you realize that maybe these feasts and festivals, maybe Shabbat has a lot more to do and is a lot more important than some people think? Why? It's an appointed meeting. Well, he's telling you what's going to happen at this appointed meeting. At this appointed meeting, there's going to be a connection, a vav that's made. And at this appointed meeting, you're going to be able to put on the esh, the fire of his presence, and there's going to be a transformation. You're going to be one that not only hears, but now is able to go forth and speak and see it take place as you begin to walk in that dominion, because you've been committed to the idah, to the appointed meeting and times. Amen? Which seems to indicate then, if you've not been at the appointed meetings, you're somewhere listening to someone else. And how many realize that whoever you're listening to, remember, your hearing affects your future. No one can hear for you. You have to hear for yourself, and you have to understand that your hearing will affect your future. It will affect whether you walk in dominion, the blessings and the promises, or not. But it will all be because of what you chose to listen to. Not what your pastor chose to listen to or chose to say, but what you chose to listen to. Not what Moses went and listened to. Moses went and heard the voice. It was the rest of Israel that had the issue and chose not to. It comes from the root word, this term for congregation, Idah, it comes from the root word Strong's number 5709, ed, and it means witness or testimony, but it's from the root meaning to return, to repeat, to go about, to do again, to restore. Perhaps it's a return to the access and the intimacy that was first lost in the garden. He's talking about this is a time of teshuvah. There's going to be a restoration. There's going to be a return. Something's going to happen again. How many realize when you go into the wilderness, once again, it's going to be a restoration that's taking place. Something is going to do again. It's going to go about. There's going to be a repeat of what first took place. It's a cognate of the word ada, Strong's number 5710, and it means to pass on, to lay aside, and it's in the sense of removing a garment or clothing. Now remember, whenever there's a change of garments, it's indicating there's a status change. And so when he makes this declaration to count the heads of the congregation is literally inferring that as they're counted, the garments that they've been in, and how many realize they came out of Egypt, the garments of slavery and bondage, the garments of their carnal flesh, that's going to be removed. That's going to be taken off, and you're about to be garmented with the esh, with the fire, the light of his presence. It's no accident that the root word, this ayin dalet root, ed, meaning a witness, it's quite interesting because if you realize that there are two letters that are seen enlarged in the Shema passage. In Deuteronomy 6:4, the ayin of the Shema and the dalet of echad, one, are enlarged in every single Torah scroll. Ayin dalet, the witness. What is it the witness of? It's the witness that there is one that will hear, and when they hear, there's going to be a garment change, a status change, and they're going to be able to put on those fiery words, his presence, and begin to walk in dominion and power like has not been seen before. Shema Israel. What did the Messiah say? It's the greatest commandment. He didn't just throw that out there. Yeah, that sounds good. Let's just say the Shema. He knew what he was talking about. He was the walking voice. The greatest commandment is to Shema Israel. If you can hear, then you're going to have a mindset change. If you can hear, you'll have a nature change. If you can hear, your garments will be changed and you'll begin to walk in what I created you to walk in. Amen? Now, as we look at these words in depth, it seems that when they're counted, it was designed to enable Israel to receive, to raise up, to bear the fire of his presence, removing the garments of shame, slavery, and bondage in order to testify and witness and proclaim who Yahweh is. How many realize that in the days ahead there may be a famine of his voice, but there should be a generation that's been brought to the wilderness that now in turn is wearing that voice. They've put on that voice, and now they begin to be a witness. They proclaim, they testify, they declare wherever they go in the midst of devastation, darkness, in the midst of the Philistines seeming to have overrun the entire earth. They proclaim and they testify who Yahweh is, and they're literally a walking fire for him. Amen? And yet we find that the removal of these garments, and therefore the status change, depends upon their ability to shema, to hear and obey. It makes you wonder what would have happened if Adam had listened to the voice of Yahweh when it walked in the garden instead of hiding and choosing the compromised covering. The voice was Mashiach. The voice was the Messiah walking in the garden in the cool of the day, calling to Adam in a fallen condition, and yet Adam chose not to listen, and now here we find ourselves today. What would have happened if Adam shemad? What would have happened if Adam chose to listen? Could there have then been a counting, a transformation, a change back to the very thing he had lost? Because it was no different than when they had the encounter at Golgolet. It was the same voice. It's also interesting to note that they are numbered here in the same pattern, tribal order of how they are then instructed to camp around the tabernacle and how they will move going forward. When you read the order here in Numbers chapter 1 and you read the names as they're listed, and this is how they're going to count the tribes, it's not by their birth order. They are counted by how they will camp. And so it seems to be focusing and pointing towards, and if you remember, if you continue to read on, after they're counted, they're then told this is how you're going to camp. And there's a connection. Wait a minute, that's the exact order you counted us in. And now you're putting us in this formation. And remember, when they're counted, it's about a status change. It's about a change of garments. And so it seems to be that the way they camp is going to reveal that status change. It's going to reveal this change of status and the change of garments that's happened. Well, how do they camp around the tabernacle? The camping alignment mirrored that of the celestial patterns in the heavens, the constellational signs, and that of the four creatures that surround the throne of Yahweh, seen in Ezekiel, Isaiah, and Revelation. And if you want to know more about that, Pastor David has an entire book about this called Ezekiel's Wheel. Shameless promotion. And yet we find that they then camp around the tabernacle in the image of these four faces: the man, the lion, the eagle, and the ox. And as they're camped around this formation, they become a mirror of the celestial bodies in the heavens. Well, what does Paul tell you? The Jerusalem above, that's free. That's where Yahweh is. And now he instructs them, Israel, if you will encamp in the same pattern, what do you think is happening? What was above is supposed to transcend and be transposed upon what is below. In other words, a character, nature change. Israel's literally putting on the presence of the Most High. They're becoming his abode in the wilderness on earth. Amen? It's an astounding picture that's being presented with this camping alignment. Remember, it's only after they have an encounter with the fiery voice, when they bring the half shekel, are they given these instructions. Not when they first enter the wilderness. In fact, they've been at Sinai quite a while now before he tells them, oh, by the way, this is how I want you to camp. It took some time for this transformation. It took some time for this change to take place. They had to be numbered first. Before they could camp in this pattern, they had to be counted. They had to have an encounter with the voice. It's interesting because the word voice, kol, it starts with the letter kuf. The ancient picture of the kuf is that of the rising and setting sun, which circles the earth. In Psalms chapter 19, verses 4 through 6, there's a very interesting statement that's made there. It says, in them, and it's referring to, if you go back and read all of Psalm chapter 19, you'll realize he's talking about the constellational signs in the heavens. In them, the firmament and the 12 houses of the constellational signs, hath he set a tabernacle for the sun, which is as a bridegroom coming out of his chamber, and rejoiceth as a strong man to run a race. His going forth is from the end of the heaven, and his circuit unto the ends of it, and there is nothing hid from the heat thereof. Israel, when they camp upon the wilderness in this pattern, they're patterning themselves after the message that was written in the heavens. Israel encamped in the wilderness literally becomes that physical tabernacle for the kol, the voice, the sun, the bridegroom to encircle and begin to pass through. The same thing that the natural sun does in the heavenlies, the Mashiach, the fire of his presence, would now begin to encircle and go through the tribes of Israel in the same pattern, running the race, his circuit unto the ends of it. And if he's bringing his people once again to the wilderness, as Ezekiel and Revelation points towards, it would seem once again that's his intent. Once again, there's going to be a status change. Once again, he's going to begin to align his people and give you instructions. You go here, you go right here, you go right here, and you go here. Why? Because you're making the dwelling place, and when the dwelling place is ready and made, then the Son, the living Elohim, the kol, the voice, his fiery voice, will now begin to encircle and run through that encampment. Amen? In other words, you and I become a tabernacle for his voice. And then this is being contrasted to those who have chosen to wallow in the Dead Sea. Listening to the voice of another, they'll experience a famine. They'll experience devastation. But you now are encamped in a place where you're literally the dwelling place of the voice. The fiery voice from heaven now will make the circuit among the camp of Israel. In fact, here in Numbers chapter 4, these four faces are referred to as the standard of the camp. The word standard is Strong's number 1714, degel. It's a banner or a standard. But it's interesting because it has a numerical value of 37. It's the same as the Hebrew word, Strong's number 3851, lahav, which indicates and means a flame or a flaming blade. It's a different word in the Hebrew, but it's quite interesting. It's the same picture of the flaming blade, the flaming sword that guards the way to the tree of life. When Israel, after they're counted, after there's a status change, after their nature is changed, and they now encamp around the tabernacle, they literally become the flaming sword that protects the way to the tree of life, literally to his presence in the center of the camp. Once they are counted, they are commanded to camp by their standards, inferring that as they have put on these new garments, the fire of his presence from hearing the fiery voice speak, they now themselves become a wall of fire or flame around the entire camp. In the midst of the darkest season the world has ever seen, Yahweh makes a promise that for those that will hear, you'll become a flame of fire surrounding and protecting and declaring the way. Amen? In fact, in Zechariah chapter 2, verse 5, he says, "For I, saith Yahweh, will be unto her a wall of fire round about, and will be the glory in the midst of her." Why? Because the coal, the sun, is going to make the circuit among the 12 houses. And as he continues to run that circuit, he'll become that wall of fire that's surrounding. And yet, as he runs the circuit, he's also the glory, the pillar in the midst of the entire camp. And we find that this is his intention when he brings you into the wilderness. And it's interesting because at the very beginning, Shepherd John was talking about the standard that was lifted up, a banner. What does Yeshua say? If I be lifted up, I will draw all men unto me. What was Israel lifting up when they lifted up the degel, the standard, the banners? They were lifting up the voice. They were literally becoming one that would raise up the voice, the fiery voice of Elohim. And as they lifted up the standard, it would then draw all men here. It would draw everyone here. And how many realize that in the midst of the greatest devastation that the world has ever seen, he's making a promise to his people? I will be a fire, a wall of fire around you. I will be the glory in your midst. There's going to be a status change that takes place in the days ahead. The one that has been seen as good for nothing, thrown away, what good can come out of this? They were in bondage. They don't have a right to this. They have no access. And yet he's making a promise. If you'll come and you'll be numbered. If you'll come and you will hear the voice speak, then not only will there be a transformation that takes place, but you'll be one that's able to raise a standard in the days ahead, and you'll become a fiery light in the midst of darkness. And just as Yeshua proclaimed, you'll be able to go forth and proclaim, "He that hath an ear, let him hear." Why? Because you're carrying the coal, you're carrying the voice, and you now become his mouthpiece. Amen. Shabbat shalom.